The land has its own laws, written in stone and wind. It teaches that some things, like a human soul, have no price, only a cost that must be paid. The Arizona sun beat down on the scorched earth, the air shimmering with heat. 18-year-old Eliza Holloway stood perfectly still, a statue carved from dust and despair. Her calico dress was limp, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her brother, Cornelius, or Corb as everyone called him, leaned over a crude wooden table. The sour stench of cheap whiskey and fear clung to him like a second skin. His finger, slick with sweat, traced the line for his signature on a document that held her entire future in its ink. The paper was her cage, and he was the one locking the door. Across the table, the Comanche man named Chayton watched without expression. He was not a fearsome giant, but something more unsettling, like a shadow given form. He was tall and lean, with eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. Corb pushed the paper forward, an act that was supposed to be a guardianship agreement but felt like a bill of sale. He could not meet Chayton's gaze. He could not meet Eliza's. He simply stared at the dirt, a man hollowed out by his own weakness. The deal was done. Her life now belonged to the silent man with the unreadable eyes. An old prospector named Jeb, a friend of Chayton's, gently touched Eliza's arm. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a small kindness in a world that had suddenly turned cruel. He led her toward a wagon, its canvas cover bleached by the sun. Eliza walked without looking back at the pathetic figure of her brother. There were no words of farewell, no final glance. The bond between them had been severed by betrayal. She climbed into the back of the wagon, her movements stiff and mechanical. Her old life was over, left behind in the dust with a drunken signature. The wagon lurched forward, its wheels groaning in protest. The journey into her new life began in a heavy, oppressive silence. Eliza stared out at the endless expanse of rock and scrub, a landscape as empty and uncertain as her own future. She did not know where she was going or what awaited her at the end of this dusty road. She only knew the stark reality of her situation. She had been traded away like livestock, her future now resting in the hands of a stranger who moved with the quiet deadliness of the land itself. For nearly 2 days they traveled. Chayton rode ahead on his handsome bay Appaloosa, a solitary figure against the vast horizon. He never looked back, a guide leading them deeper into an unknown world. The sun was relentless, beating down on the wagon's canvas top. Eliza sat in the stifling heat, the rhythmic creak of the wheels, a constant reminder of her journey into captivity. The world she had known, small and familiar, grew more distant with every mile, fading into a memory that already seemed to belong to someone else. Jeb, the old prospector, handled the reins with a steady hand, his silence as profound as Chayton's. He offered her water from his canteen and shared his dry biscuits without a word, his tired eyes holding a hint of pity. As the sun began to set on the second day, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they finally arrived. The ranch was nestled at the edge of a rocky canyon, a small, sturdy cabin built of rough stone and dark wood. It looked strong, defiant against the wilderness, a fortress of solitude. The interior of the cabin was ascetic but impeccably clean. A simple table and 2 chairs stood before a cold stone hearth. A narrow bed was built into one wall. Chayton entered, his moccasins making no sound on the wooden floor. He did not break the silence immediately. He moved with a deliberate grace, his presence filling the small space. He gestured toward a small room, separated from the main area by a thick canvas curtain. The gesture was simple, a silent indication of her new place in this world. "That is yours," he said. His voice was low and calm, like the sound of wind moving through the canyon stones. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her since the transaction. "Food is in the pantry, water is in the barrel. I hunt, you cook." He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. "When I am away, keep the door bolted." These were not commands, but rules for survival in this wild land. Eliza gave a small, silent nod, accepting the harsh reality of her new life. This was her home now. The first night was an eternity of waking dread. Eliza lay on the narrow cot, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert. The distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of the wind against the cabin walls. Thoughts of her deceased mother, a woman of strength and kindness, mingled with the bitter taste of her brother's betrayal. She knew Corb had not sold her just for whiskey. He had sold her to pay his debts to the most powerful landowner in Serpent Creek, Mr. Finch, a man who collected what he was owed, one way or another. Eliza knew she was just a pawn in a game she did not understand, a piece to be moved on a board controlled by dangerous men. Mr. Finch was a patient predator, and her brother had just thrown her into his path. The air in the cabin was thick with silence, a heavy blanket that smothered all thought. She was acutely aware of Chayton's presence on the other side of the curtain, his stillness as unsettling as any sound. He was a mystery, a man who had bought her life for reasons she could not fathom. Was he an agent of Finch or something else entirely? Suddenly, the silence was broken. "Are you cold?" Chayton's voice came from the darkness, low and unexpected. The question was devoid of any threat, any malice. It was a simple inquiry, a moment of startling humanity. Eliza's heart, which had been hammering against her ribs, slowed its frantic pace. She swallowed, her throat dry. "No," she whispered, her own voice barely audible. He had not asked if she was afraid or if she was crying. He had asked about her comfort, a small, simple consideration. That small question became the first stone in the foundation of a fragile calm. It did not erase the fear, but it changed its shape. It suggested that her new reality, while harsh, might not be the nightmare she had envisioned. For the first time since leaving her home, a tiny, improbable seed of hope began to sprout in the barren soil of her despair. Her fate was still uncertain, but perhaps it was not sealed. Perhaps the silent Comanche man was not the monster she had feared. At the first light of dawn, Eliza was already awake. She moved with a quiet purpose, a determination to prove her worth, to carve out a space for herself in this new life. She found cornmeal and coffee in the pantry, and soon had a simple breakfast prepared. The smell of brewing coffee filled the small cabin, a familiar comfort in an unfamiliar world. It was a silent act of defiance, a way of saying she would not be broken. She would endure, she would survive. She set 2 plates on the rough wooden table. Chayton emerged from behind the curtain as the first rays of sun touched the canyon rim. He moved to the table and sat, his posture straight, his movements economical. He ate the cornmeal mush without a word of thanks, but he cleaned his plate completely. His silent consumption was an acknowledgement of her effort, a tacit acceptance of her presence in his home. It was more meaningful than any polite phrase. He drank his coffee, his eyes looking out the single window toward the vast empty landscape. When he finished, he rose and took his rifle from the pegs on the wall. He left without a word, disappearing into the wilderness as silently as he had appeared. Left alone, Eliza immersed herself in work. She swept the floor, tidied the shelves, and organized the pantry. There was a strange solace in the routine, a sense of purpose in the mundane tasks. She was not a guest, nor was she purely a prisoner. She was a fixture in this place, and she would make it her own, one small chore at a time. Chayton returned in the late afternoon with a deer slung over his shoulders. He laid the animal down outside the cabin and motioned for her to come. Eliza expected him to simply hand her a knife, but he did not. Instead, he began to show her how to properly skin the animal, his long fingers moving with practiced skill. He pointed to the best places to make the cuts, explaining in his low, calm voice. They worked together in the fading light, a silent partnership forming over the shared, bloody task. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, a routine stitched together by shared silence and mutual tasks. Eliza found a strange peace in the predictability of it all. Each morning she would cook, and each day he would hunt or work on the small ranch. She began to notice small, considerate gestures. The woodpile was always restocked before it ran low. A small pouch of wild herbs for seasoning would appear on the pantry shelf. The water barrel was never allowed to get empty. These were his silent words, his way of communicating. One afternoon while cleaning, she found a small leather-bound book tucked away in a wooden chest. It was not a Bible, as she might have expected. It was a worn volume of English poetry. Her fingers traced the faded gold lettering on the cover. As she opened it, she saw notes written in the margins, penned in a neat, careful script. But the words were not English. They were in the Comanche language, a series of symbols and marks that held the secrets of his inner world. This discovery was a revelation. It peeled back a layer of the mystery surrounding Chayton, revealing not a simple savage, as some in town might call him, but a man of depth and intellect. A man who read poetry and thought about it in his own tongue. It was a glimpse into a soul far more complex than she had ever imagined. The book was a bridge between his world and hers, a silent testament to a hidden life. She felt a sudden, powerful connection to the man who was her keeper. Chayton returned to find her sitting at the table, the book of poetry open in her hands. A jolt of fear went through Eliza. She had invaded his privacy. She expected anger, a harsh word. But he simply stopped and looked at her, his dark eyes taking in the scene. He saw the book, her rapt expression. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a silent acknowledgement, a granting of permission. In that moment, the cabin, which had once been her prison, began to feel like a fortress, a shared sanctuary against the harsh world outside. The monthly supply trips to the town of Serpent Creek were an ordeal. Eliza felt the weight of judgmental stares from the moment she stepped down from the wagon. The whispers followed her like a shadow as she moved through the general store, her basket clutched tightly in her hands. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, watched her with sharp, bird-like eyes, her mouth a thin line of disapproval. Eliza kept her gaze fixed on her shopping list, her face a mask of stoic indifference, but inside, a quiet fire of shame and anger burned. Her brother, Corb, was the worst. She would see him in the saloon, surrounded by other loafers, boasting about how he had profitably settled his sister's future. His words, slurred with drink, were like stones thrown at her. He made her a spectacle, a piece of local gossip. Each visit to town was a fresh reminder of his betrayal and her own precarious position. She was an outcast, tied to a Comanche man, an object of scorn and speculation. She endured it all with a quiet dignity she did not know she possessed. Sheriff Beauchamp, a former Texas Ranger with eyes that missed nothing, always found a reason to speak with her. "Miss Holloway," he would say, his voice a low drawl. "You are doing well. He is treating you right?" His questions were a test, his sharp gaze trying to pierce her carefully constructed composure, searching for any sign of fear or abuse. "I am well, Sheriff," she would reply, her voice steady. "Mr. Chayton is a man of his word." She offered him nothing, protecting the fragile peace of her new life. After one particularly difficult trip, she returned to the cabin feeling drained and defeated. Chayton saw the weariness in her eyes. He said nothing, but later that evening he placed a small clay jar on the table. Inside was a fragrant salve made from pine resin and sage. "For your hands," he said, his voice softer than usual. Her hands were chapped and sore from work, a fact she thought no one had noticed. This simple, wordless gesture of care meant more than 1,000 words of comfort. It was a balm for her soul as much as for her skin. The following week, a sandstorm descended upon the canyon. A wall of wind and grit swept across the land, forcing them to take refuge inside the cabin. They barred the door and shuttered the window, plunging the room into a dim, dusty twilight. The roar of the wind was deafening, a relentless assault that erased the outside world. Trapped together in the small space, the air grew thick with unspoken tension. They were two solitary islands, suddenly forced together by the fury of the storm. To distract herself from the oppressive closeness, Eliza rummaged through an old chest and found a stack of ledger paper and a piece of charcoal. She sat at the table and began to draw. First, the familiar shapes of the canyon rocks, then Chayton's Appaloosa from memory. Finally, gathering her courage, she began to sketch the man himself as he sat staring into the fire, his profile etched by the flickering flames. The act of creation was an escape, a way to process the silent, powerful man who dominated her world. When the storm finally passed, she left one of the drawings on the table by mistake. Later, she returned to find a small, exquisitely carved wooden hawk sitting beside it, its wings spread as if about to take flight. It was his silent answer, an acknowledgement of her art, of her. Soon after, Sheriff Beauchamp paid another visit, this time more hostile. "I am asking you plain, Chayton," the sheriff said. "What are your intentions with this white woman?" Before Chayton could answer, Eliza stepped forward. "I am here by my own choice, Sheriff, and under my own protection." After the sheriff left, the silence in the cabin was heavy with questions. Finally, Eliza found her voice. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why did you take me?" Chayton looked at the fire for a long time before he spoke. He told her of a promise made to her dying mother, a woman he had respected. He had promised to watch over Eliza. He knew of Corb's debts to Mr. Finch, and he knew Finch wanted not just the girl but the land she would inherit, the land with the only freshwater spring in the entire district. He had taken her to save her. That single revelation shattered the world Eliza had constructed. Chayton was not her captor. He was her protector. The knowledge settled deep within her, rearranging every thought and feeling she had about him. They were no longer keeper in charge, but partners in a dangerous secret, united against a common threat. The dynamic between them shifted, the silence now filled not with uncertainty, but with a shared understanding. They were allies, bound by a promise made to the dead and a very real threat from the living. Their lessons became more intentional. He taught her how to track animals, how to identify edible plants in the harsh desert landscape, how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds. In return, she helped him with his English reading, using the old books her mother had left behind. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, the poetry book open between them, her voice soft as she explained a difficult phrase, his low tones repeating the words, tasting the foreign sounds. A quiet intimacy grew in these shared moments. On their next trip to Serpent Creek, Mr. Finch himself blocked their path. He was a large, imposing man in a fine suit, his face fleshy, and his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. A silent, formidable hired man stood by his side. "This land will be mine, savage," Finch said, his voice dripping with contempt as he looked at Chayton. "And the girl, too. There is nowhere you can run where I will not find you. You cannot protect her from me." The threat was plain, a promise of violence hanging in the dry air. The ride back to the ranch was tense. The unspoken danger was now out in the open, a tangible thing between them. That evening, Chayton looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. His gaze held no mystery, only a deep, profound anxiety for her safety. "Finch will not stop," he said quietly. In that moment, the cabin ceased to be a simple shelter. It had become a fortress, their fortress, a small bastion of defiance against the greed and cruelty of the world. And they would defend it together. The fragile peace was shattered a few nights later. Old Jeb came riding hard on his mule, his face a mask of urgency. "He is coming, Chayton!" the old man gasped. "Finch has gathered his men. They are riding this way now." Chayton did not panic. He moved with a calm, deadly purpose, taking his rifle from the wall and checking the action. He was not a man who ran from a fight. He would stand his ground. He would protect his home. He looked at Eliza, his eyes telling her to hide, to be safe. "I am staying with you," Eliza said, her voice firm and clear. It was not a request, but a statement of fact. She had not come this far to cower in a corner, while he fought her battle alone. She went to the chest and retrieved the second rifle, the one he had taught her to use. Her hands did not shake as she checked to see that it was loaded. They were partners. They would face this together. A look of surprise, and then profound respect, passed over Chayton's face. He gave her a single, sharp nod. When the riders appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the rising moon, Eliza was ready, standing in the shadow of the cabin doorway. The attackers, led by Finch's hired man, did not expect such a resolute defense. They tried to set the cabin alight, but Chayton, knowing every rock and crevice of his land, kept them at bay with well-aimed shots that kicked up dust at their feet. The night exploded with the sound of gunfire and angry shouts, a chaotic battle for survival under the cold desert stars. In the heat of the fight, one of the thugs managed to circle around, creeping up on Chayton from behind. Eliza saw the movement from her vantage point. Time seemed to slow down. She remembered Chayton's lessons, his calm voice instructing her. "Take a breath. Squeeze. Do not pull." She raised the rifle, aimed not to kill but to stop, and fired. The bullet struck the man in the shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground with a cry of pain. The attack faltered. Having lost the element of surprise, Finch's men retreated into the darkness. In the ringing silence that followed the battle, they tended to each other's wounds. Chayton had a long scratch along his arm from a ricochet. Eliza's shoulder was bruised and sore from the rifle's recoil. As she cleaned his wound with a damp cloth, their hands touched. It was a simple, fleeting contact, but it was charged with the intensity of all they had just endured. The shared violence and survival had forged their bond into something unbreakable, something stronger than steel. The last walls between them had crumbled into dust. The next morning, they did not wait for another attack. They rode to Serpent Creek, with Jeb beside them as their witness. Eliza, who months ago had been too afraid to meet the sheriff's gaze, now walked into his office with her head held high. She stood before his desk and calmly, clearly, recounted the events of the previous night. She told him of Finch's threats, of her brother's debt, of the fight for her life and her home. Her voice was steady, filled with a newfound strength. Her words, supported by Jeb's testimony and the already circulating rumors of Finch's wounded man, gave Sheriff Beauchamp everything he needed. By evening, Mr. Finch and his hired guns were under arrest for armed assault and attempted seizure of property. The reign of fear he had held over the district was broken. As they rode away from town, Eliza felt a lightness she had not known was possible. It was the feeling of justice, the feeling of a heavy burden finally being lifted. Back at the ranch, Chayton pulled the old guardianship document from the chest. He held it up for her to see, then slowly tore it in two. He then handed her another paper, a legal deed filed by the sheriff. The land, and the precious spring upon it, was now in her name. "You are free, Eliza," he said, his voice filled with respect. "The land is yours. You can decide your own path." In his other hand, he held the small wooden hawk. She took the carving, her fingers closing around it. She looked at him, at the cabin, at the vast canyon that had become her home. "My path is here," she said softly, but firmly. "With you,